Hello and welcome back to Planet and the People. Welcome to Series 2 of Planet and the People, the podcast about climate change and everything that it entails. It is a cold, crisp March morning, but the sky is blue, there's not a cloud in the sky, and I think that spring really is here now. There was a little taster of it a few weeks ago and then it plummeted, but I think this is it. So anyway, Series 2, I've got some fantastic guests in line. Thank you very much for sticking with it. If you've listened to the first series, and if you listened to the first series almost a year ago when it was released in the early stages of the first lockdown, then thank you so much for sticking with it. It has been quite a long gap. And welcome to any new listeners. I have got some fantastic guests lined up for Series 2. Talk about fashion, talk about pandemics and why we've been having the year we've been having from an environmental breakdown point of view, talk about carbon offsetting, talking about theatre, lots and lots of interesting things. But today I wanted to kick things off with an episode all about international politics. Do not be alarmed. I simply wanted to explore the issue of how it can be incredibly demoralising and frustrating when, not only your own country is maybe not pulling its weight properly. I know the United Kingdom could be doing a lot more, but when you see other countries that are actively committing environmental crime on a daily basis, or you have world leaders who are actively denying climate change is real or serious. One example springs to mind is a certain president who declared to the world, "We need global warming, it's freezing," and then proceeded to take his country, arguably the most powerful country in the world, out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and throw all their green policies out of the window. I'm talking of Donald Trump, in case that wasn't clear, but he's gone, which, if you are worried about climate change, is an encouraging outcome. However, he could be back, and there are other world leaders who share similar views. So it can be a really, really, really frustrating, boring, terrifying issue. So I wanted to ask the question, how can we, as a world, as a globe, as an international community, come together and fight climate change? So to help me with that rather daunting subject, I spoke to climatologist Professor Chris Rapley at University College London and returning guest Professor Mark Maslin, also at University College London. Both of these guys have a wealth of knowledge not only about the science but also about the economics around climate change. They advise on policy on a regular basis, and they have attended the Conference of Parties, which, if you don't know much about COP, well, you're about to learn. It is the international conferences where international climate policies are born, basically. A little disclaimer, unfortunately, there were some sound issues on Mark's end. Just a few distracting, rather strange noises that were coming through. It's not constant, it's fairly infrequent, but in those moments that it does pop up, I apologise, and I hope it's not too distracting, because what Mark is saying is pretty brilliant. So, without further ado, I will pass you over to a cold November evening in 2020 and my conversation with Professor Mark Maslin and Professor Chris Rapley. Do you remember, Mark, last time we spoke, which was back in April, I think, and we said next time we see each other, it will be in person.
Little did we know that this was going to be a year-long event.
Yeah. Anyway, today I would like to talk about climate change from an international perspective, because that is exactly what it is. It is an international issue. And Over the last few years, I have heard a lot of people have a little bit of a what's the point attitude. It can all seem a bit futile when you've got, for example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand making some fantastic policies. And then across the water from them, we've got the Prime Minister of Australia who is describing anyone environmentally minded as woke greenies. So I suppose the big question that I would like to ask you both, but that is the big question. That is the question of the episode rather than a question I want you to answer straight away, is how do we make the whole world act? So, before I attempt to dive straight into that question, let me ask a little bit about the both of you. So, first of all, Chris Rapley, tell me a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I've been called worse things than a woke greenie. I'm a professor of climate science at UCL, but I've had a varied and interesting career. Previously, I ran the Science Museum, and then moving backwards, I ran British Antarctic Survey, and prior to that, big international global change research program. But my origins are as an experimental scientist using rockets and satellites to study the cosmos and the Earth. So I've always been interested in how one delivers the story of whatever science it is you're doing, because it's certainly, in my experience, true that if you tell the story right, people are really interested. And so more recently, I've been focusing much more on how we connect what we've learned about the climate system with society, policy and people. And that's led me into whole new realms of working with neuroscientists and marketeers and storytellers and theatre playwrights and producers. And it's been revelationary. So that's where I am now, in this gap between what we know and how we use that to do something adult and sensible about it.
Actually, you speak of playwrights. I interviewed for this podcast April de Angelis because she's in that world of trying to write stories and trying to look at environmental activism. But Mark, now you were the first guest on Planet and the People. So for those people who haven't listened to the first episode, well, they should, because Mark, you were fantastic. But give a little bit of an update on who you are.
So I'm Mark Maslin, and I'm a professor of Earth Systems Science, which is a beautiful, broad term because I'm not sure how to classify myself. I look at past climate, I look at present climate, I look at future climate. And as Chris will know, I look at everything from early human evolution to how I can help Mark Carney sort out carbon trading to make sure that companies can offset reliably and actually know that when they pay money, they actually are removing carbon from the atmosphere. And so, like Chris, I bridge a gap. I bridge a gap between academia, policy, and the corporates. Because I understand business, I understand where they're coming from, and I actually empathize with them at the same time as understand the policy wonk and also what academic information is telling us, and also why academics are jumping up and down going, you must save the planet, and the policy people going, it's not that easy, and the corporates are going, I've got shareholders. And so together, and I think that's something that Chris and I both feel, is it's a collective, and together actually we can actually solve climate change in the future.
Maybe I could just butt in there and say it's been called the greatest collective effort or greatest collective challenge that humanity's ever faced. But earlier you asked the question, how do you get the whole world to act? You actually don't need to. You don't need to get everybody to act, as long as you get enough people and the right people. And I think what both Mark and I have been trying to do in similar but different ways is to find those pressure points where somebody can make a big difference. And I mean, you've only got to look at the Greta Thunberg phenomenon. One small person motivated millions of school children around the world. Well, now you can say, well, what tangible result has that achieved? Well, actually, quite a lot. You don't get invited along to sit and chastise the head of the United Nations for nothing. So individuals can make a big difference. So you don't have to have everybody.
Okay, that's an interesting point, and quite a refreshing point, actually. So I suppose it would be good to go into the history of all of this a little bit. And Mark, you sent me an essay you wrote, Mach 26, Road from Rio to Glasgow. And I have to say, it read a little bit like, I may take this in the best possible way, it read like an epic historical but modern political adventure novel where you read sections of it and it feels great, the world are coming together and making all great decisions, and then another chapter disaster hits and everyone comes up and cocks up and you pull your hair out. So yeah, it was a really gripping read. I'll start by asking you to kick off with, so Margaret Thatcher addressed the UN in the 1980s outlining the science of climate change. And that, I suppose, is the beginning of the story. So, Mark, I'll ask you to set the scene.
So the scene really was set by the end of the 1980s, when the science that had been around for 150 years, but particularly in the 1950s and 60s, had actually coalesced into our understanding of the climate system. And then we had this upturn in the global temperature curve that basically said things are changing and it's caused by humans. It basically ended up by 1989 with Margaret Thatcher spending half an hour at the UN chastising other leaders that we had to do something about climate change. And interestingly, she used that word, and it was not in common usage. It was usually global warming. I think the most interesting thing is, had we taken her and President Bush Sr., who was also very positive about dealing with the environment, they'd actually done it then, we would have had a much easier job. Because one of the scary facts is half the extra CO2 in the atmosphere that we've put there has been put there since 1990.
Oh, God.
So we've had 30 years to deal with this problem, and we sort of didn't. It culminated in 1992 with the Rio conference, which was an incredible outpouring of world leadership saying we must protect the environment. Then we had the Kyoto Protocol that came into effect that said developed countries will cut their emissions, and then developing countries will join. And then it all sort of went off the rails. So there have been these moments where high points where we thought that suddenly the international leaders were coming together and there were actual movements towards reducing emissions. And then, as you said, it's like the Game of Thrones. Suddenly, everything goes wrong, everything goes horrible, and we have a dip for 10, maybe 5 to 10 years before suddenly we have more energy for it.
Maybe I could just butt in there. For me, 2015, end of 2015, and the Paris Accord, COP21, was a significant turning point. Important but not sufficient, because for 30 years previously, the nations of the world had been arguing about, should we do something about climate change? And in Paris, they said yes, and we will. And of course, their commitments were not sufficient. But once you've got that agreement and the instruments and mechanisms are put in place to then start doing something about it, then you can begin to crank up the ambition and do something about it. So there was a big swerve 5 years ago. And of course, recently, I don't know, Mark, you will have seen that the estimates on the basis of the renewed promises, the new promises that have been made in the last few months, from China and the UK and the European Union and so on. On that basis, the estimate now is that by the end of the century, instead of hitting sort of 3.4 degrees centigrade, plus or minus a certain amount of uncertainty, which was where we were immediately after Paris, those estimates have come down, and you're getting, even close to the 2-degree ambition. Obviously, the ambition is to do better than 2 degrees. But it does mean that, at least in principle, that cranking of ambition is underway. And now some nations are getting worse, others are getting much better. But if you want to look for hopeful signs, that's the area to look.
So I want to talk a little bit about COP, because strangely, a lot of people who I speak to who are incredibly environmentally conscious don't really know about COP. So first of all, what is COP? It's Conference of Parties. Tell me about it.
Okay, so the UNFCCC was set up to negotiate reductions in greenhouse gases to deal with then global warming, now climate change. The Conference of the Parties are the annual meeting of the parties, i.e. all the countries of the world get together and actually try to negotiate binding and now pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I think what people don't realize is it isn't just a one-off. It isn't just, hey, every December we suddenly descend on a nice city and basically have a chat. The meetings are going on all year round. And so there are meetings for every single different section, whether it's to do with the loss and damage that might occur with climate change, whether it's to do with the fundamental science, whether it's to do with economics and their health. These meetings are all the time. And what happens is they have a focus each year, which is the big COP meeting. And it has usually two chairs. So the one that will be in Glasgow, which has been delayed from 2020 to 2021, will be co-chaired by Italy and the United Kingdom. And they are then mandated to try to actually bring all the parties together and try to get some agreement. And there have been some incredible successes. So Kyoto was a great success. As Chris said, Paris was a fantastic success. Copenhagen in 2009 we won't mention because that had the same sort of level of excitement that Glasgow has, but completely bombed for many different reasons, which we don't need to go on.
Well, actually, could I ask you about that? Because I think Copenhagen did have some excitement around it. There were many high hopes. So why did it go so badly wrong?
I think fundamentally because of the global financial crash. Okay, I think that is a backdrop to people assuming that doing things about climate change cost money. And that's something I think we should return to, because there's some really interesting stuff that's come out recently that shows actually you're going to save lots of money and make more GDP if you actually do deal with climate change. I think that was the first thing. The second thing is that the geopolitics was all wrong. The Danish did not understand geopolitics. They did not understand how to get 192 countries together and actually get them to negotiate. Whereas the French, I hate to actually give credit to the French, were absolutely superb. I mean, they used every trick in the book. I mean, they got certain presidents from certain countries to phone up other presidents to say, your negotiating team is causing a bit of a pain. Could you tell them to stop? They were brilliant. I mean, they basically spent 2 weeks using every French diplomatic skill known. Whereas the Danish just thought everybody would turn up, they'd be Scandinavian, they'd be sensible, and everybody would agree something. And of course, by the end of the first week, they were bogged down in detail. And so what they did, they made a mistake, was they whipped out, hey, look, we have a Danish text. We've written one for you because obviously you can't get yourself together, which completely ruined it because the developing countries said, hang on, is this just a coup? Have you just written a report and we just have to sign it? This is not negotiation. And the second thing is, in week 2, they realized that they didn't have a big enough place, even though they should have looked at their list and gone, these are all the observers who legally, like myself, because I organize the observers for UCL, can be there to observe the negotiations. And then all the high level, they just had no space. So they chucked out all the NGOs and said, I'm sorry, there's no space. Which, of course, caused a huge riot. It's like, hang on, we don't trust you if you can't be seen. And then the worst thing is, and I hate to say this because I do feel for him, Obama comes in and basically decides to be all American and goes, oh, yeah, we can sort this out. So basically takes China, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa into a side room, literally into a side room, and go, yeah. We don't need these binding pledges. Why don't we just have an accord where we just say, yeah, my country would do X? And the reason being is, A, America wanted to get out of the Kyoto Protocol because they'd never signed up. They were having difficulty seeing how they would get anything through the House of Representatives or Congress. So if Obama could just say, look, I need a win. And if we just say, yes, we're going to do this, and we all basically shake hands as gentlemen and go, yeah, we can do this, that's fine. And so Obama basically bombed Copenhagen and we came away with nothing. And as I'm sure Chris will say, it took 2 or 3 years to get the negotiations back on track. And I have to say, then the French, in Paris, the brilliant thing was in Paris was they went, yes, this is the agreed text. And there were certain countries that went, I'm not sure I've agreed to that. And now we're going to have a 2-hour lunch break after the announcement to translate the report. At which point, everybody rushed behind you with, what have we agreed to? I'm sorry, what have we agreed to? And it was just so beautifully stage managed. It was great. And as Chris said, has really turned the whole ship around. We're now pushing in the right direction.
And there were some wonderful players, Christina Figueres, for one, who both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes played blinding roles in terms of, who could, well, first of all, who would dare argue with Christiana, but who would want to? Yes. She recently published a book, the World We Choose. I'm trying to remember the title. I recommend it. It gives you a very optimistic view of what we can do if we put our minds to it. So let me just add a slightly darker side, and we tend to leave this in the background, but there was what appeared to be a pretty well coordinated attempt to torpedo the credibility of the science as well. And you
at Paris?
Yes, before Copenhagen.
Before Copenhagen.
Going back to the dark side of Copenhagen and the many factors that led to its unsatisfactory output. And that was the ClimateGate incident, when the University of East Anglia server was hacked, and people sifted through thousands and thousands of emails and managed to find a few phrases that could be taken out of context. But in this world of slogans and, fast news and fake news, came up with some hugely damaging, quote, evidence that the climate science community was not behaving in an appropriate way. Nobody's ever been able to prove it, but the fact that this all happened, 2 weeks before Copenhagen, or even 10 days before, it certainly did not help. And in many people's minds, it was really material in undermining commitment, or allowing those who'd never really wanted to come to an agreement anyway to have a suitable excuse.
What sort of things did it harness? What sort of things did people?
Well, if you're doing mathematics and you're struggling with a sort of mathematical impasse, particularly if you're trying to analyze data, you sometimes talk about a mathematical trick. Well, this is a very technical term in the sense that it means something very explicit in the world of mathematics and science. It means, wow, that's a really clever way of solving this problem. But of course, a trick in the real world is a trick. Yes, I fooled you. And so that was one of the phrases. They managed to find that one of the scientists had emailed to another one saying, oh, we should use Mike's, or whoever it was, mathematical trick to solve a particular technical problem they were trying to deal with. And so then this was put in the context of, well, here they are, they're manipulating the data. Remember, in those days, the evidence that climate change was real and driven by us was not as solid as it is now. I mean, things have moved on a lot. And so it was possible to cast doubt. And of course, this goes back to a long way to the world of the tobacco companies in the United States, decades ago. And there's an infamous email, there weren't emails in those days. There's an infamous memo from a senior executive in one of the tobacco companies saying, look, let's not try and disprove the science that smoking, induces cancer, because we can't, because we know it's true. But what we can do is sow doubt. And as long as there's doubt, then that gives politicians the opportunity to delay, and the general public a lack of confidence in supporting policies. So as long as we can throw grit in the machinery, that's in our interests, because we will delay whatever action it is we don't want to happen. So it was straight out of their playbook, and just an application in the world of climate science. There's a wonderful book on this called The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes, and it's been around for a few years now, but it documents all of that story in some detail.
The interesting thing is that the same commentators who were paid to throw doubt on smoking were then wheeled out to actually then throw doubt on climate change.
Yes.
We also now know that even today, there are oil companies and petrochemical and fossil fuel companies who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars having PR campaigns throwing doubt over climate change, or just throwing doubt over policies. So basically, any policies that seem to shift away from fossil fuels, they'll go, well, do you really want to do that? Actually, this could be worse, cost more, etc.
I'd really like to pick up on that because my neuroscience colleague, Christina, as soon as we got through Paris, he said, right, we're into a fascinating new phase now. He said, when you look at the damage that those who have been sowing doubt have been able to achieve with science, where there is a truth, he said, given the traction that they've achieved in that area, just wait to what they'll achieve now when the debate has shifted from the science to the policy, because now there are all sorts of opinions. There is much less solid ground upon which to work. So they will have a heyday. Interestingly, it's not quite worked out like that, because I think the sort of drumbeat of climate change is so loud now. Californian wildfires, the biggest Atlantic hurricane season, melting in the Arctic, fires in the permafrost areas, in the tundra. All of that is becoming so commonplace. And then you get voices of, authority like David Attenborough intoning how dangerous this all is. So actually, public opinion has shifted despite those efforts, but nevertheless, they're still out there working as hard as they can to delay progress.
I mean, one of the big key things that is really calling the death knell on fossil fuels is economics. And this is something that nobody realized. So I've got friends at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and they were predicting the costs of renewables. No one predicted that the cost of renewables would crash through the floor. It is incredibly cheap now to actually have wind, solar, or any other form of renewable sort of like power. So the other problem that the fossil fuel companies have is if you put the two up against each other, you will pick renewables every time because it's just cheaper, easier, and you don't have the geopolitics to worry about. And so this is the interesting thing, is that maybe the drumbeat of climate change has driven innovation, has driven sort of like technology to the point that actually a lot of fossil fuel usage can be seen as obsolete, and we can just move on in economics. So as a fossil fuel company, you're facing the huge political backlash. You're then facing the public who really don't want you. And then the economics is then stacked against you.
Absolutely. And all that anybody wants is convenient energy, to deploy in whatever way they want to deploy it, heating their homes, traveling around, whatever it is. They don't care whether it comes from a liquid that you get from a pump on a forecourt or whether it's from a battery or whatever it is, as long as it's convenient and as long as it delivers the performance that they're looking for. So, for example, electric cars are just about getting to the point now where if you buy one, you can feel confident that you're not at a disadvantage to having bought a petrol car. And, that transition is unstoppable now. There are entrepreneurs out there who've said, like Tesla and so on, saying, well, look at the market value of Tesla, from nothing to being God knows how many times, worth what GM is and so on. So that is really transforming the landscape. That is, as Mark was saying, has come at a speed that nobody really predicted. So, I mean, for example, last year, India, I think, cancelled, 20 or 25 coal-fired power station contracts because it was just not economic. And of course, the other thing is that the oil companies know this, and some of them are more, if you like, ethically minded than others. I advise or have advised one of the oil companies, and I don't envy them their task. Because if you, a little thought experiment, sit there as the chief executive of an oil company or oil and gas company, the writing is on the wall. For all of these reasons, you're going to be out of business. You're going to be the next Kodak, or, you think of lots of examples if you don't do something. But what are you going to do? First of all, you've got to decide where you want to land. What are you going to be? The biggest solar panel company? Well, that niche is pretty much filled up. What else is out there for you to be a major energy company in 20 years' time? So even if you can figure out what that is, so what is the trajectory? Will you need all of those people who are brilliant at installing enormous structures in, the North Sea? No. Will you need your downstream business where you've got all of these forecourts all over the place, pumping liquid out? Well, if it's a biofuel, maybe. Otherwise, probably not. Will your shareholders who've got used to having, double-digit returns each year, be happy and content for you to take this dangerous new direction? No, probably not. They'll rush off and pump their money into somebody else who doesn't do this. So it's actually, even those enlightened companies that would like to do this have got a real struggle to find their way from A to B.
Do you, this is going to be the really tricky question, do you have an answer?
I haven't applied to be the chief executive of an oil company.
Because BP have made quite a few shifts and changes recently. For that reason, they're abandoning a whole load of their oil reserves. They are making a shift. Do you know what direction they're making a shift towards?
I don't know the detail of BP, but what I do know is that in other examples, much trumpeted changes in direction, if you lift the lid, the amount of investment that's going still into maintaining the existing oil and gas business far outweighs anything that they're putting into these new areas. So they're hedging their bets. And you see their argument is perfectly reasonable. They say we're a completely legitimate business upon which your well-being relies. If we were to flick the switch tomorrow, you would starve within weeks. And I mean, I won't go into that. I was going to say we may do anyway, but
okay.
But that's a whole other.
Let's save that for another conversation.
Not get on to. But their point is they're a legitimate business. They're delivering. Sometimes they overdo it and say, oyster-eyed, we're simply delivering what our customers want. And you can say, no, your customers just want energy, actually. They don't really want, your energy. They're happy to take any energy. So if you provided with them with an alternative, particularly if it was cheaper and more convenient, they'd buy it. So, they've got a problem, and I don't envy them, but they are sort of dipping their toes in the water, some more than others, and making steps in the right direction.
I also think it really matters what sort of fossil fuel company you are. I mean, I think Chris and I would both agree that the age of coal is dead and buried, and therefore coal should just be wiped off the face of the earth because it is so polluting, and we just don't need it.
I wanted to get back to the COPs again. Could we go into a little bit more detail as to how COP21 panned out and the Paris Agreement itself? What were the most exciting things that stood out for you about the Paris Agreement? And I suppose, how well are we all doing at sticking to those goals?
Okay, I'll pitch in and then Mark pick up. I was there, and I think the sudden emergence of the 1.5 degree aspiration was a big surprise. That caught a lot of people by surprise. And at first, I think there was a sort of feeling of incredulity because it was obviously going to be hard enough to get commitments to stick with 2 degrees. And the idea that we might go for 1.5 degrees when, if we are unlucky, we will go bombing through it within the next decade anyway. There's all this uncertainty about the carbon budget and how much there is left, for us to burn and so on. So I think we were all a bit surprised by that, but somehow, probably because it was handled very well through these backroom diplomatic channels that Mark was sort of alluding to earlier, but somehow it had the opposite effect. Instead of causing people to sort of reel around going, oh my God, it was hard enough in the first place, the sense I had from the floor was it absolutely energized people, it inspired people and said, my goodness, well, if we're talking about that, right, let's really roll our sleeves up and see how we can go for it. And then the practical outcome, I think the important thing is that the mechanisms were put in place, the machinery, the various backroom committees that, as Mark was saying, meet all the year, that said, right, well, in 5 years, you've made these voluntary commitments. Unfortunately, they don't add up at present to deliver the 1.5 to 2 degrees, but we now have a legitimate and indeed pressurized system of what you might call Sherpas and discussions, which are now trying to crank up this ambition and constantly seeking, where the pressure points are, where the opportunities are to improve those commitments. And as I say, we're seeing the results of that because we're seeing commitments now, particularly by China, which is going to have a huge impact, that are driving us in the right direction. Now, next year we'll see just how far they've gone, and in due course humanity will look back and see just how much was actually implemented.
Did they go into the nitty-gritty with the COP meetings as to exactly what the problems are and how to solve them, such as things like agriculture, things like energy, things like fuels, things like vehicles? Do they actually go into, okay, we commit to these goals, but how are we going to actually do that? Is that something that is discussed at COP?
Well, there's some level of discussion, but the key is that the breakthrough between Copenhagen and Paris was that the whole approach changed after Copenhagen, and people said, you know what, we've been struggling to get a kind of quasi top-down, heavily committed, rigorous framework within which we're inviting everybody to agree and participate. And there are so many different factions and undercurrents. I mean, not the least that, you can say, oh, well, Britain only emits 1.5% or maybe 2% of global emissions, at least through our production ones. If you take our consumption ones, a bit different. But if you look at the legacy, Mark was talking about all that carbon dioxide that's sitting up in the atmosphere. We've been burning it for a lot longer than anybody else, and very vigorously. So to cut through all of those arguments, which were completely clogging up the system, they said, look, why don't you just go away, have your own little caucus in your own nation, and just come back and make us an offer. So that's what people did. And of course, then they factored in all of those things. What can we do in transport? What can we do in agriculture? What can we do with, our legacy building stock? And so when they came forward with those commitments, they'd factored all of that stuff in.
Okay. So the question I want to ask is, which of the countries, this is one for both of you, I suppose, which of the countries around the world that you are most worried about, that you feel are most falling short, really, of climate commitments? Can you answer that?
Well, I think we should ask it in the other way. I think firstly we should start with the positives. So for the last 30 years of the negotiations, everybody's been talking about, oh, maybe we can make a 70% cut or an 80% cut. Now, everybody's talking about getting to net zero by the middle of the century. And so that's a complete change in the discussion and the end point. And again, if we think about it, firstly, the UK last year announced that the UK Climate Change Act, the actual goal would be net zero by 2050. We've had Boris announce that we're going to have a 68% cut by 2030. And then there's going to be up to an 80% cut by 2035. Okay, so that's just the UK. Europe have just announced that they are going to make a 55% cut in European emissions minus the UK by 2030. China says their emissions are going to peak by 2030, and then they're going to hit net zero by 2060, which, as Chris said, this is the first time China has ever given a long-term pledge. And the interesting thing is it's done by their their president, and therefore it's going to happen. Then in America, we have a complete change of guard. We have sort of like Biden coming in. John Kerry has been told to be the climate change ambassador, and already they're talking about rejoining the Paris Agreement and actually undoing the 100 laws and guidelines which Trump removed from the US to actually reinvigorate the actual green economy, and also their commitments to reducing CO2. So let's take the positives away, which is the three major trading and emissions centers in the world: USA, Europe, China, are all making big commitments.
Absolutely. And I agree. I think you need to start with the positive. And I said earlier, you don't need everybody. And if one or two drag their heels, that may or may not be a problem. In the end, they'll find it increasingly difficult if the major players push in the right direction to remain as laggards. Can I just pick up on one thing, though, that I think is really, really important? And that is that net zero, of course, if you walked out on the street and said to somebody, do you know what we mean by net zero? I think you'd pretty likely get a very puzzled look. But as long as we translate that into we're going to be carbon free. We're going to have a society that no longer damages the climate by pumping stuff into the atmosphere. The concept people get, what phrase or slogan you use to describe it, is another issue. I use "we're going to abolish fossil fuels" because although it's not quite accurate, that's something people can understand. The reason I use that is because these trajectories with their dates and their percentages, I think, can be very confusing. Obviously, technically, you have to agree what those trajectories will be. But the abolitionists didn't say, well, we're going to reduce slavery by 30% by 1815 and 64% by 18 whatever. And it's the same with the civil rights movement and women's emancipation. They said, slavery is, in the first case, slavery is an abomination. We're going to eradicate it. Not having the vote is absolutely unforgivable. We're going to change it. So I think framing the whole climate problem, well, firstly, is an opportunity, but secondly, in terms of an absolute, the world in 2050 had better be off its carbon addiction. Otherwise, we're in trouble. Now we can all have an adult discussion about how we get from A to B. So I think you have to allow a little bit of leeway for some things to go at the right pace. And not everything has to go at the same pace. Some things can happen much quicker. And that can compensate for other things that are a little bit more troublesome. So I like these absolutes. Abolish fossil fuels, net zero. If you're into the techno speak, once people get that, then something that you were hinting at earlier, that people go, well, I'm not sure what to do about it. As soon as you put it in those terms, they go, oh, actually, come to think of it, I could probably do a bit of this and a bit of that, which would head us in that direction. And it starts to open up possibilities.
So I suppose the question, though, that I would like to ask. So a few years ago, there were all the great fires that were sweeping through the Amazon, and they have been doing so since then as well. That wasn't a one-off, but that was something that caused public outcry. And Bolsonaro came forward and said the Amazon belongs to Brazil and stuck the finger up, essentially. And also, I breathed a sigh of relief when Biden got voted in this time around, thinking, okay, great, we've now got the USA is now back in the game. But when you've got world leaders who are denying climate change, who are doing things that are destroying the efforts of the rest of the world, you feel a little bit powerless. So is there anything that you would say on that point?
I think that it's a bit like, should you wear a mask or not wear a mask? If you're 25 years old and you're pretty unlikely to be infected by COVID, or you'll survive it if you do, you may say, well, I don't think I can be bothered to wear a mask. But, I'm in a group that is very, very susceptible. And so you're putting my life at risk. And the same is true of people who are contributing to climate change in all sorts of ways where they don't have to. And so to some extent, turning your back on them and just leaving them to get on with it isn't really an option. Despite what I said earlier, you do have to wag a finger at them at least, and possibly sanction them to try and get them to behave in what one would regard as a collectively responsible way.
That's what I was actually going to ask. That leads on neatly, because what are your thoughts, both of you, on embargoes and sanctions against countries that are essentially committing environmental crime?
Well, let me just pass on that, because you see, now you're asking me to go from being policy relevant to policy prescriptive. And I think it's really dangerous when scientists do that. We might have some ideas about things that they could do. And so if they said to us, what are our options? We could say, oh, well, thank you for asking us, you've got this, this, and this option. But I think it's very dangerous when scientists become advocates, although increasingly we're finding that we have to, because the world isn't listening in the way that we feel it should. But up until recently, most scientists have felt very, very nervous about stepping across the line, because we've then got skin in the game, and it calls into question whether or not we're suffering from biased assimilation and, motivated reasoning in our science.
I have to say, I completely agree with what Chris is saying. So what you can do as a scientist is you can just point out some of the actual facts, which is companies that actually declare their carbon to the Carbon Disclosure Project on average make 60% higher profit than companies that don't. Countries that are building their green economy are growing quicker than other countries. And if we look at the UK climate change report, it says actually, if we do everything to get to carbon neutral or net carbon zero by 2050, our economy will grow by 3%. Our employment will be 1% higher than it would be. And yes, it will cost us between 0.5% and 1% of GDP. So actually, that's a net gain. And so I think the interesting thing is it is not sanctioning countries. If countries want to go down the fossil fuel route and they want to destroy their environment, weirdly enough, all they're doing is damaging their own economy, and the rest of the world are basically piling on into the green economy without worrying about anybody else. I mean, I wrote a paper last year with transactional data looking at the size of the green economy. And we showed that in America, had Trump really wanted to be the greatest jobs president ever, he should have invested in the green economy. There are 10 million jobs in the green economy in the US, where there's only about 300,000 in the fossil fuel industry. And so if he was looking at pure economics, if he was just a hard capitalist, neoliberalist, etc., he would have invested all into the green economy. And so the problem is the rhetoric of many of these right-wing politicians doesn't fit the economics of the 21st century. And so therefore, it's the economics that's going to actually win the day, not their countries having sanctions.
Well, as indeed China is showing, because China has done very well out of deciding decades ago to invest in being the nation in the world that is the most efficient at producing solar panels and so on. That cost curve which has collapsed has been partly, very much due to China's efforts, and they're making a lot of money out of it. Thank you very much.
Where are China with their coal at the moment? Because they've been described as heroes and villains at the same time because they've been investing huge amounts in renewables. Where are they with their coal?
Well, there are two things. Firstly, they still rely on coal quite a lot. And what's more, it's partly to do with the levers of control. It turns out that the Chinese regions are not quite as compliant and linked to the central policymakers as you might expect. And so in particular areas, it may suit local politicians to continue to invest in coal, both from their political point of view and from the local economy point of view. And so it's always difficult to completely drive a nation top down, even with the politics that you find in China. The other area where there is a kind of darker story is the development that they're pushing very hard. They're investing very hard in Africa. And their use of coal is much less defensible. I mean, they're much into that. As Mark says, in the end, their own economics will ultimately drive the solution. And I mean, and you see there are social tipping points. 10 years ago, I was asked to brief the UK pension funds at their annual meeting in London. And I gave a talk on climate change and was faced with just utterly blank faces. I mean, there was just, who let this guy in? Am I in the right room? There's something wrong here. And how the world has changed, because the pension funds people and the big investors are kind of banging on climate scientists' doors saying, we're in real trouble. We've got carbon bubbles, we've got stranded assets, we've got exposure to fires and floods and God knows what. There's mayhem taking place now. Please help us. How can we handle this? And they're trying to get out. I mean, it's not just that, students and others are pushing organizations to disinvest from coal investments and so on. The sharp investors are going, hell, we've got a fiducial responsibility to ensure that our investments on behalf of our investors or pension funds are secure. And if we're not careful, we're going to be in real trouble, because we know that there's a problem. And if we don't act on it, A, we will get into trouble, but B, we will be roasted because they will hold us accountable. So the coal industry, I think Peabody Coal has gone bust, hasn't it? Wasn't that when Trump took over? That was one of the strongest US companies. Maybe I'm getting this not quite right. But Trump digs coal is a pointless slogan, and as Mark says, one that's completely ill-aligned with reality, but actually quite well aligned with Trump's previous record as a businessman. Another story.
It's another topic. So it would be really useful to actually close things up a little bit by talking about COP26 and to ask you both what your expectations are for COP26 next year, what you hope for, all of that really.
Okay, so COP26, I think the first really important thing to say to your listeners is that in many ways, the pandemic has delayed the COP, and actually that's helped us to deal with climate change. The first thing is the British government was never ready for this autumn with all the other issues that they were trying to deal with. Second thing is, none of the rest of the world was quite aligned in the right way. So the American election would have occurred just before the COP meeting, so there wouldn't have been any head of state there. So actually delaying it by 1 year has actually done us a huge favor because it says, okay, we now have another 12 months to actually think about it. I think we also have to take into the lessons of the pandemic. And I think this is really important because I think people have woken up to the fact that when there is a major crisis, who are the only people that they can hopefully rely on to look after them? Government. It's not the companies. So when we look at the next big crisis after this pandemic, it's climate change. And it's now this realization, I think, right down to the people on the street, which is actually no, companies are there to make money and to sell us stuff. They're not there looking after my health or my children's health. So I think that's a big shift mentally. And I think for COP26, what we're looking for is, one, ratcheting up the actual ambition. Basically taking the 5-year perspective, which will now be 6 years on Paris, and say, what have you done now? And show us what you're going to do in the future. And I think there's going to be a lot of rhetoric and what's really interesting, competition between countries to better the other country and actually be able to do this. And the weird thing is, underneath this, as Chris said, the economics is just changing so fast that actually the cost of doing this, actually it's going to be costly not to actually shift to a zero carbon economy.
And if I can chip in here, you talked earlier about Mark's paper, which tells this roller coaster story of the real world. Remember, Macmillan said, when asked what dictated his policy, he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And I think we have been extraordinarily lucky in this very, very perverse, awful way that COVID has put a 1-year pause in this story, because we've got Biden and John Kerry and people like that now coming back into play. So we've gone from a very big negative to a very big positive in terms of the US influence in this story next year. And as Mark said, in the end, things come down from the top. The leaders are there. We elevate certain individuals to be leaders for a reason. And I mean, again, the COVID epidemic has shown that if you don't have your leaders held accountable and also smart and intelligent and driven, for the public good, then you get into trouble. A major pandemic has been sitting at number 1 or number 2 of the UK's risk register for at least a decade. And what did people do? Well, certain countries that got burned by SARS and other things, South Korea and Taiwan and so on, had learned their lesson and they were prepared. They were ready for it. And the result is they've suffered very few deaths. Other nations, let's not name them, have done really badly. So leadership really matters. And as Mark said, there's no difference in principle between preparing for and dealing with and managing climate change as there is with major pandemics. And there will be other pandemics, so we'd better get used to that too.
I think COP26 is a platform to negotiate ambition to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and the systems to take them out of the atmosphere. So, for example, reforestation is one of the ideas that lots of people laud up and think is a great idea for many reasons, as well as supporting the biosphere. It is not the place necessarily to deal with the biosphere. So there are other conventions that actually deal with the biosphere, and they're going to have a big meeting next year to talk about how we protect the biosphere.
When you say the biosphere, do you mean biodiversity, life on...
All living creatures?
So less so much about greenhouse gases, but more about the whole wider problem of biodiversity and
natural environment.
Yeah. Absolutely. So basically our life support system, which, as Chris said, you don't take a chainsaw to. But we are.
Who attends COP aside from the world leaders?
Well, there are lots of what you might call Sherpas. There are lots of people, the Michel Barniers of the climate world, the people who are carrying out these negotiations on behalf of. And then there's the big, firework display, the big showcase thing where the presidents or the prime ministers or whoever sweep in. And they will have been briefed very quickly on what the situation is, where the blockage points are, what needs to be unblocked, what they can do. So it's a kind of layered thing. I mean, because there are thousands of people attending, aren't there? I've forgotten how many now, but it's an absolute, circus. And in that sense, COVID has taught us that you don't really need that. You need a certain amount of that. But you don't need the 20,000 hangers on, and maybe we can be accommodated in the way that we are now through cybernetics, through Zoom, and that's been a big positive that's come out of COVID. But and in the end, who actually makes the decisions? It's the truth of the matter is it is probably a handful of the most powerful, the sort of thing that as Mark described, Obama was trying to do somewhat ham-fistedly in Copenhagen in a rather desperate situation. But the truth is that in the end, a small number of people will say, do you know what, I think this is close enough now that we can go for it, and then everybody else will go, great.
So I want to ask a last question, really. Well, a last question that leads on to another. Well, a last question.
You're beginning to sound like Monty Python.
It's the
last question. Well, no, there is the big last question, which is a short question. But what can individuals do if you want to influence what happens at COP26? What can I do, or any listeners do?
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing is just write to your MP and keep the pressure up. And interestingly, all of the messages that are completely consistent have been consistent for years now. When you talk to members of Parliament, is they say, our post bags are full of stuff about jobs, the National Health Service, all the stuff that you might expect. There is very, very little on climate change. There is much more now than there used to be, but it's still not, top of the list. And so write to your MP is a really good thing to do.
And what would you advise you write?
Oh,
to be really basic.
Well, I'm sure that if they don't exist already, there will be pressure groups who will offer you, prescribed text, the sort of thing that I get through my phone all the time, asking me to go for this petition and that petition, and you can then vary it a little bit. But if you want to put in a little bit of legwork, then you can look at have a bump round the web, and then express concerns that you extract from your new knowledge of what the issues are. You do a bit of homework.
Listen to this podcast.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yes,
of course. I have to say, I mean, one of the really exciting things from last year, not during the pandemic, was I think the influence of Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future. So it was really interesting that Extinction Rebellion, when they were gluing themselves to trains, disrupting things, they were almost dismissed by politicians as they're the usual cranks. It's easy to say they're not us, even though there was an incredible diversity of people in age and races there. It was fantastic. But what was interesting is when you had normal school kids going on strike and basically saying, this is really important, you adults have mucked it up, could you solve it and sort it out before we become adults and we vote? That actually had a real interesting resonance. Most politicians sat up. Now, some of them were very radical and started attacking children should not be seen, should not be heard, etc. But actually, a lot of them really sat up and went, hang on, this is the next generation that's calling us out. Perhaps this is something important. So I would say, yes, absolutely write to your MP. But actually, when we're allowed to, let's go back out and protest.
Absolutely, and I should certainly now I regret having stopped when I did.
I didn't interrupt you, Chris.
No. You because you've caused me to rethink. Of course, one should write to one's MP, but what we know is that what is much more effective is if you manage to rally a group of your family or friends or work colleagues or whatever to do that in a group. If you write a group letter, and what's more, if you write a group letter, then your question about and what should it say suddenly becomes much more interesting, because now it's the result of a conversation that you've had with people. And actually the co-benefit is that you're opening up that conversation that in the public square, which has been so difficult to get going. I mean, climate change has been a real Cinderella subject, a real taboo. 5 years ago, and I'm sure Mark has had the same experience. If you're with a group of people, I mean, let's say at a restaurant or whatever, and somebody turns to you who doesn't know you very well and says, "What do you do for a living?" 5-10 years ago, if I said I'm a climate scientist, there would be an embarrassed silence, and they'd say, "Oh, the broccoli looks nice, doesn't it?" And they would change the subject. And there are lots of reasons for that, as often as not, because as in their case, let's say relatively educated people, they were very worried about exposing how little they knew or understood about the subject. They're embarrassed. But that's changed. And now, when you say I'm a climate scientist, as often as not, people will say, "Oh, that's interesting. Can you tell me about this or that?" So anything that continues to open up that conversation is great, because then you don't know what will emerge from, 1 in 10 people may go on then and change a whole, area of society, because they get driven to get on with it and they have the opportunity to do so. So it should be a collective thing, not an individual thing.
I also think, Tom, that your listeners have to actually realize that they are consumers.
Yeah.
And as consumers, they have really powerful choices. And companies know this. So there are lots of choices you can make whereby you can choose a more sustainable fashion brand, or you can choose a more sort of eco-friendly washing liquid. And these little things matter, because if everybody makes these little changes, then suddenly the whole market shifts. So, for example, if you happen to be like me, have to pay the actual bills for your house, okay, shifting to a green or a supposedly green gas certificate actually costs me nothing. If you have a pension, you can shift your pension to a fund that doesn't fund fossil fuels. And again, as I say to people who are lucky enough to have investments or money that they've saved, don't put it into fossil fuels. You're just going to lose money. Put it into stuff that's going to have double-digit growth, which is the green economy. So I think there's lots and lots and lots of things we can do. Weirdly enough, one of the things that we can do is we can eat more vegetables. And like lots of the things that I talk about, it's a win-win. It improves your health at the same time as reducing the carbon emissions to the planet, okay? I'm not one of these people that says, never eat a beautiful steak. I couldn't do that, okay? Just occasionally, I need to have a good steak, okay? Vegetarians and vegans will come and kill me, I know. But just occasionally. But most of the time, we should be eating vegetables, because that's better for the planet, better for your heart, better for your gut, and basically reduces emissions.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that in the end, though, you have to interrogate your own conscience about every action that you take. And remember that every lettuce leaf embodies its own weight in oil, actually. So even if you become completely vegetarian, you can't escape. We're all trapped in this heavy carbon world. But it can't become a tyranny. We can't all start, pointing fingers at each other and saying, "Oh, I heard you went on an airplane the other day." In the end, it's our life, it's our decisions. It's not sensible to emasculate your life or your family's life for this cause. However, it is important that one should interrogate everything that one does and make a positive decision about it, even if the end, for very good reasons, you can't, match a zero carbon world immediately.
Can I just quickly clarify, if one was to write to their MP in relation to COP26, they might say, these are the policies to do with climate change that I want to see happen in this country and internationally, and list off whatever policies they particularly value?
Yes, I think so. Or you could turn it around and say, dear MP, can you please tell me what your plan is? And, what are you going to do? And that puts them on the spot. And then you're not actually dictating to them anything, but you're certainly interrogating them and holding them accountable.
Yeah, and that's a much easier letter to write as well. So lastly, one quick one before you go. Mark, I asked you this question at the end of the last interview, and I've been dying to know whether your answer is the same, Mark. So, Chris, How upbeat do you feel about climate change and about us turning things around at the moment?
People ask me, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I often say on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm optimistic, and because you get swayed by events. You see something like the announcement from President Xi a couple of months ago, and you go, wow, that is a game changer. We're now heading in the right direction.
What was that?
He's committed to that China will be carbon neutral by 2060.
Okay, yes.
And as Mark says, when the Chinese president says that, you can be pretty confident that they will either make it or exceed it, and it's very unlikely they'll miss that target unless something totally out of expectation blows them off course. Force majeure. I really oscillate. It's clear that we can do a lot more than we can. That it's clear that we can make the world a much better place for our children, grandchildren, future generations. But at the same time, you see what's happened in the United States over the last 4 years. It's like being on a snakes and ladders board. So it's not really a question of being optimistic, pessimistic. I just have commitment and determination, because if we give up on that, then there is no hope. So we generate hope by constantly being on the ball and keeping pushing. So that's my message. You just never give up. And if in the end we do go down, we'll go down fighting. But as long as we keep fighting, there's a chance we'll do something useful.
That's a great answer. And Mark, last time you said this is the first time you've actually felt genuinely optimistic about climate change for 10 years. And I've been dying to know whether you still have that view, because things have happened since then.
I'm still very optimistic. Maybe I'm different to Chris because maybe I just self-generate my own hope, which is awful, okay? I think where my optimism comes from is not the politicians, is not all these statements. Is actually interacting with young people, because what is really interesting is they are so different. They have completely different agenda to us, and because they are so connected, so they have a mobile phone, they have their tablets, etc. They can connect with anybody in the world instantaneously. They know how small the world is. They have ability to sift out through this morass of news and knowledge, actually what are the facts and what is real and what's not, which I think other generations haven't been able to catch up with. And I think from that power, that they see the world very differently. And in many ways, because of the speed of technology, they're almost a different, they're a different species because they think in different ways, And this was shown by 4.5 million young people around the world going, I'm going on strike on a Friday once a month to tell the politicians you're doing it wrong. And so we may not get it right, and this generation of politicians may fail, but you've got these huge wave of young people who think about the world in a completely different way. And I think that's where my optimism comes from. We may have screwed the planet, but actually the next generation is actually fully equipped to actually come and undo all the damage we've done.
I absolutely agree. I think that's a terrific way to end up. And Greta Thunberg very famously said, did she not, in front of the United Nations, the UNFCCC, and the president of the UN said, I'm not here to plead with you. I'm here to tell you that you have done it wrong, and change is coming whether you like it or not. And I'd say, yeah, absolutely.
Well, Chris Rapley, Mark Maslin, thank you so much for giving your time today. That has been a fascinating conversation. There you have an overview of international politics when it comes to climate change. Interestingly, Mark Maslin did mention the individual choices that we could make to help protect the planet and impact policy, and that is coincidental because that is exactly what next week's episode is all about. I spoke to editor and founder of online eco magazine Pebble and author of the book Is It Really Green?, Georgina Wilson-Powell, and we discussed that very issue, how we can make greener lifestyle choices, what those lifestyle choices really mean, and what the wider impact of those choices is. If you've enjoyed this episode of Planet and the People, do please click subscribe so you never miss a future episode. Also spread the word, tell friends and family, and even leave a review online if you feel so inclined. And there is also, of course, a backlog of episodes from Series 1, including an episode all about food and how farming can be both a climate problem and a climate solution. I also spoke to Ecosia, the tree planting search engine. I talked about carbon capture, talked about the Arctic and how to protect it, and much, much more. And of course, if you enjoyed listening to Mark Maslin in this episode, he talks to me in the very first episode and gives a general overview all about climate change, both the science and the economics of it. I am on Instagram and Facebook at Planet and the People, and on Twitter at Planet and the P. So do give us a follow and a like, and you can keep up to date. I hope you have a good week, and I will bid you farewell.